The word is café and the spelling is C-A-F and E with an acute accent. So café is a word which has become well domesticated in English, I think, to mean a place where you go and drink coffee and maybe other beverages and snacks and so on.
In French culture, obviously the café is a key symbolic venue, it's a key symbolic environment.
So it comes from the French, and in French it means both coffee and the place where you drink it.
And the café certainly is a very important symbol of Frenchness, of French civilization.
Both café, in the sense of coffee, and the English coffee come originally from the Turkish kahve, which is a pronunciation, I think, of an Arabic word. And those two terms, coffee and café, really came into popularity in the 17th century when you had café and coffee houses becoming enormously fashionable, enormously popular in England and in France and indeed in other European countries, and then spreading to North America and so on.
The first really famous café in France, I think it was founded, if I've got the date right, in 1686 by somebody called Francesco Procopio de Cotelli, and it was founded in the Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Procope is a famous Parisian café.
These café or coffee houses are interesting not so much because of the beverage that is sold in them, but because they were places of debate and discussion, scientific discussion, scientific experiments. There's a letter in Montesquieu's Lettres Persanes, Persian letters, where his Persian visitors are really struck by the fact that somebody who's talking about geometry is better received in a cafe than are the old soldiers who are sitting in a corner.
Cafes in France are synonymous with a sort of popular democracy, if you want. They are thought of frequently as a place of intellectual and cultural exchange, but in a relatively open, democratic way. So some sort of alternative to the literary salon, if you want.
They're seen as being quite radical in a way, quite seditious, so that in England, for example, I think Charles II tried to close them down at one point because they were so dangerous as he saw it. And in France, in Paris, you've got places like the Café Procope, which is associated with Enlightenment thinkers.
Famously, Balzac, the French novelist, Balzac referred to the café as the parliament of the people.
But although we have that rather romantic idea, I suppose, of the public sphere and the coffee houses as egalitarian debate, I suppose one of the points I would make as a feminist is that they tend to be all male locations. We look back to the origins of the coffee house in Turkey, for example, and know that that's an all-male space in an Islamic environment where there's quite a strong sense of sexual segregation. But actually at the time you've got sexual segregation in Europe too, up to a point, and coffee houses were where men met.
French people might refer to the café as a sort of a public living room.
And what's interesting is that there's a different history in France and England, if you like. That in England you've got this incredible period of the coffee house, the 17th and 18th century, and then in the 19th century it really sort of starts to go into decline. And funnily enough, that's when the word café migrates over as a, to mean a place where you have a drink and have a bite to eat. So it actually comes over in the 19th century. In a sense, the café comes back into England as an important space, people would say, almost in the 1990s with Starbucks and so on, the Italian café coming via North America back into Britain.
A very famous café in recent times would have been the Deux Magots in the Saint-Germain-des-Prés area. This was the café de Beauvoir and Sartre frequented after the war. So this is still a place people would go to today, simply to go to a cafe, but also as a kind of intellectual pilgrimage to try and catch a whiff of that sort of heady post-war intellectual atmosphere.
But in France, the cafe tradition has continued to be really important. And if you think of left bank cafes and the existentialists Sartre and Beauvoir and so on, we still see the cafe as a great place of public debate and intellectual conversation, and somewhere where you can go and work, where you can sit down and write, for example, if you're a writer. I think one of the points about a French cafe is that I'm going to say I don't like the word all. French cafes serve alcohol. I mean, that's one of the important things about French cafes. You can go in and have your glass of red wine.
There's a lovely mixture, I think, of unhurriedness combined paradoxically with bustle. And I guess the way we express that, people who go to France and enjoy French life, is we would talk frequently about watching the world pass by. And there's a feeling that people are just weaving the cafe experience into their everyday lives. I think that's what we really appreciate about cafes, and that's what gives them, as I say, part of the texture of everyday French life.
And of course there's the idea of the pavement cafe. I remember the first time that I ever went abroad, I first went to France, and I sat out on the terrace, the pavement cafe, with a lovely cup of coffee and a croissant, and I thought, I've arrived, I'm watching the world go by, this is cosmopolitan, this is Europe, this is very, very different from England at that time.
The cafe, unfortunately, is in relative decline in France. That's undeniable, and in many ways you can see a parallel there with the relative decline of the traditional pub in Britain. I mean, to give some facts and figures, it's estimated that in 1960 there were around 200,000 cafes in France. Now there are probably somewhere around 40,000. And there's various reasons for that. Changes in people's drinking habits, the smoking ban that came in 2008, a general recession, all those things have come into play. But that's not to say, particularly in Paris, there's still a lot of interest. Cafes still fulfill an important social and symbolic role in France, and as I say, particularly in Paris.
In French, café means both coffee and the place where you can drink your coffee.
Yes.
How do you tell the difference between the two when you're talking to someone?
I think it's usually pretty obvious from the context. But café, of course, in French means a black coffee. That's one of the favourite mistakes when you first go to France and first trying out a little bit of French, and you ask for what you think is a coffee, which might be, particularly in the past, it was coffee with milk, and you just get a little tiny black coffee, more like an espresso, and that's a terrible shock that you have to specifically say you want a crème or a café au lait if you want some milk in it.
Well, I would just order a express, just a straightforward, proper French coffee. No, none of your Starbucks.